Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and as you listen to this, I'll be making some turns at Mission Ridge. My kid and I are heading over there for midwinter break, and while the good folks at Elan Skis sent me a brand new pair of Playmaker skis, which look like they're going to be a game changer, especially in soft snow, I'm not going to be mounting them up. This week is going to be all about standing sideways. My kid has been skateboarding a shit ton this year. He's gotten so into it that on dry weekends in Seattle, sometimes he chooses to hit the skate park or go street skating instead of going skiing with me. It's cool that he's found something that he's passionate about, and while he still loves to ski, he's really excited to try snowboarding. So I got him a group lesson for a few hours on day 1 at Mission Ridge, and then on day 2 he's going in for a private lesson. And hopefully after 3 days of riding at Mission Ridge, he'll be able to figure out his edges. I'm bringing my snowboard too, and while I don't really claim it, I was a snowboarder once in my life, and I don't know if I've talked about it much on the podcast, but working in this industry is really what turned me off to snowboarding. I mean, I came into my job at K2 with a few 100-day seasons in a row. I lived in Vail, and I really lived the life. I was riding every single day. But I blew my knee out on a snowboard, and after surgery and rehab, I ended up getting a job with K2 Skates and Skis. I eventually took a job with K2 Skates on Vashon Island. And the whole reason I got into this job with K2 Skates was because I love snowboarding, and I wanted to work in the snowboard industry. So I got this job, and I figured maybe I would try to work my way over into the snowboard side. But at the time, I was playing inline hockey, and I loved skating as well. So it meant that I got this job at K2 and I was riding the boat with the K2 snowboarding crew and the Ride snowboarding crew and the Moro snowboarding crew. And while the Ride guys were always super cool to me, the K2 snowboard crew and the Moro snowboard crew were such assholes to me. They all thought they were so cool because they snowboarded. But most of them didn't snowboard at all, or at least half as much as I had been snowboarding the past few seasons. So they were a total joke to me. And maybe that attitude, along with not really snowboarding that much, is what made Moro Snowboards a price point brand at the Sports Authority and K2 Snowboards a family brand for a long time. But to me, they were all mostly wannabe hipsters before hipsters existed, instead of being what they were supposed to be, snowboarders. And they let me know the whole time that I wasn't a snowboarder and I wasn't cool because I inline skated. It was like they all still lived in high school, and people like that really, I have no space for them in my life. They are such a joke to me, and I'm sure everybody knows somebody who thinks they're cool because they do something. But you know what? You're cool because you're cool, not because of the activities that you do. So things have changed at K2 over the years, and my attitude towards snowboarding has changed a lot too. I still love it, and I try to get out there at least once a year. And now it looks like it's going to be more than that. It's going to be so much fun to ride with my kid, and I hope he falls in love with it just like he did with skateboarding. And I will say, I'm a proud dad for making sure that he learns how to do both, because I think that's important. So that's my plan. And I guess one more public service announcement. If you're a snowboarder or a skier or anyone who thinks what you're doing makes you cooler than what somebody else is doing because of your sport, please go see a therapist, because there's something wrong with you. And if you really want to be a badass in the mountains, learn how to do both sports. If you can ski and snowboard, well, there's more power to that. So I'm psyched for Mission Ridge and for the skate parks of Wenatchee this week. But you should be stoked for part 2 with Josh Loubek. This time around, Josh shares some more epic ski stories. We talk business, judging, and a whole lot more. Before we get into it with the lubricator, I want to ask you again to tell a friend about the show. Think to yourself, have I done this before? And if the answer is no, please tell a friend. If you like the podcast, your friends are going to like the show as well, and I appreciate you letting them know. It does help the show grow. And finally, please support my sponsors, as the show wouldn't happen without these amazing brands. I'm talking about Puffin Drinkware, Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Best Day Brewing, and Stanley. Now, it's time to chat with Josh Loubek. We're going to start off part 2 with something that is just a little bit different. What's the backstory on you giving the Boise State football team a motivational speech?
A buddy that was a coach there, he asked me to give a speech to the team. So I was like, okay, how do I come up with some motivational speech?
And is this in the locker room before a game and you're getting these guys ready to run out on the tunnel and go kill people?
No, man, that's funny. No, it was preseason practice in the arena there that they have. But the story was kind of fun. Like, I told them how when I moved to Steamboat, I was chasing a dream. And the dream was to become this, pro skier or whatever. And the first year that I got out there, they put us in like groups of, I guess, like ability. And there was the rad team that those guys were rippers and US teamers and all that. And then there was like the JV team and those guys were really good. And then there was the crappy team. And I got put on the crappy team and I was so bummed, right? And I kept showing up every day and I was doing my best, but I was really bummed. And the end of the year, they did this award ceremony and the awards were best ripping dude, best jumper, all the cool awards. And then they gave me an award that I thought they were messing with me. I was so like bummed. They gave me the best attendance award. And Mike, I was so bummed. I thought they were messing with me. And so I go and I get my award and I'm like, whatever, and don't think much of it. And then the next year I got most improved. And then the next year I went pro. I won the core games in Japan. I had some fun accomplishments. But when someone asked me what the coolest award was, I gotta say it was the best attendance award because I just showed up. And I gave that speech to the guys and they were really stoked on it. I thought it was a really cool thing. And the one other thing I said to him was the journey. And when I go back to thinking about all the fun that I had traveling the world skiing and doing all that kind of stuff, my best memories are before I was sponsored, when I was going to school, training for that best attendance award and skiing with my homies in hopes of the dream. So I told them to embrace the journey and be in the moment. And it was cool, man. It was like one of the coolest things I've ever done, probably.
Oh, that's pretty rad. And now I've got to hit some of the things that I didn't ask in episode number 1. And you had just talked about winning the core games in Japan, and that was going to be something that I asked about. But we'll talk about contests. I didn't ask you what the biggest event you won or podiumed at was. Would that be the core games in Japan or something else?
That was probably the biggest one because it was the most money and it was big. I mean, we went over to Japan and there were so many funny things back then. We would go over there and we would like wear Japanese clothing to work with their sponsors. So this is before internet stuff. So they had their own magazines and you would go over there and you'd like use their sponsors to make some extra cash. And then that first year I won the skier cross core games, which was rad. And then there were some big air events and all things like that. So you would walk out of there with, for us at the time, a pretty good chunk of money and the coolest culture. I mean, Japan was so early days before everyone knew about it. It was just epic. It was unbelievable.
Were you guys almost like rock stars in Japan? Because you hear about that now where Americans go over there that are famous over here and they're even bigger over in Japan. But back then when you guys were like the new school of skiing and everything was happening, were you pretty famous over there?
There's definitely like some culture things that are happening and we would go over, they'd pump us up. The media would pump us up and we would do the photo shoots. And the next year you'd go back there and you'd see your photo shoots all over like billboards and magazines and stuff like that. So there was a little bit of that for sure. I think they kind of pumped that up, but yeah, wonderful country, great people.
And when you're on billboards and magazines, you have that signature Josh Loubek look. And on the internet this week after your first podcast came out, the brand that you own, Niima, asked on social media to revisit the staple Loubek look of soul patch and earrings. Can you please comment on the look that you had back then?
Can I just like decline to comment on my look? That was so, I mean, who wants to see what you look like 25 years ago on the internet? Oh my God. Well, thanks for Niima for putting that out there. That's funny.
I know. It's like you own them and they clowned you on the internet, which is great. In the last show, we had gotten to the point in your pro career where the skiing was over, but I did mean to ask you about a powder day that you had with Glenn Plake and Bob Lagassa and the prank that happened on that day. Can you share that story with us?
Okay, first of all, Bob Lagassa and his crew in northern Idaho are hysterical. They're hot doggers from the 80s. They like were in Hot Dog the movie.
Okay.
Those guys have the greatest stories, but they're known to do a lot of pranks. And this one was we were heli-skiing. Plake was there. And what I remember, what was so rad about it is that we were heli-skiing. There was a ton of snow, but then it got super cold, super fast. And it opened up for a run that was unbelievable snow, like 3 feet of fresh, light, unbelievable snow. And I remember going like side by side with one of my heroes, Plake, in what had to be the best snow I've ever had, best run. But before that, we were waiting for the weather to break. And so, you're hanging out at the hotel and waiting for the heli to get ready. And Plake comes up and Bob, and they're like, hey, man, we're going to take off right after the heli trip. So just pack up and bring your clothes and your luggage down. And I was like, all right, I thought we were staying another night, but I brought it down and then I didn't think anything of it. We wait for another 2 hours and then we get the heli trip and then we have that run. We come back. Then they say, hey, you know what? We're going to stay another night after all. And I'm kind of like, well, what was that all about? I had to pack up and I go back, bring my luggage to my room. And then they're like, let's go. We're going to go do something. And I pull out my clothing and I realize that something's tangled up. And then I couldn't figure it all out. And what had happened was that Plake and Lagasa and Dan Herbie had sewed all of my clothing together. It was like, are you kidding me? It was such an epic trick. And that's just one of many with those guys. So if you ever hang out with them, watch out. They're awesome.
Oh, so I got to get Bob on the podcast just for a podcast of pranks.
Yeah, you do.
Now I'm going to get back to where we left off. So you were 26 and you knew that you were going to call it on your pro ski career. And you knew that before anyone. And before you tell anybody, is that a scary or sad realization that you're not going to be pro anymore?
Yeah, I think it's confusing. I think for a lot of guys that are in this world where, you're really hyping on adrenaline and doing fun trips and stuff like that. And I remember being kind of like distressed by it, but I was also kind of looking forward to what was next and how can I work in the industry and move on.
And it sounds like there was no real job search for you to figure out what was next. You go to Oakley and you're like, hey, I need a job. At least that's what you said in the last podcast. And was Oakley pretty much like, hey, sure, no problem. You can be our rep in Idaho?
It was kind of a little bit lucky timing because I had gone up to Idaho and did some of those free ride camps with Lagasa. The Oakley rep up there, Marty Matheson, was total stud. And he and I worked together a little bit when I was an athlete. And I had mentioned to him kind of I was interested in that world. And so the timing just worked out where Marty said, hey, I'm going to move on to a different position. And I think you should try to take on this position. And I had to go through a couple things there, but that's where I ultimately just moved and ended up and went right into rep world.
And the way you go into rep world is different than almost anybody else in the entire world because you get hired on to be the head rep of this bread-winning brand. And that shit doesn't happen these days or even back then, it seems like. It's like you almost have to work for a brand for years and then wait for someone to die or retire. And once that happens, then you're jockeying for position to get that head rep job. Was it a crazy thing for you to get put into that head rep position right away?
It was 20 plus years ago and it was a smaller territory. Idaho, Montana was spread out and it gave me a really good opportunity to learn about the business and the industry with really great people and accounts. But a lot of it in business is luck and timing. So there was a little bit of that. And I was really fortunate. And Oakley has been really amazing that way. They still do that a lot where they work with their athletes afterwards and kind of a big family there.
With being a rep and Oakley bringing you in, it's not all just about the skiing and knowing the product and building relationships, although that's a huge part of it. There's a ton of Excel work, forecasting, figuring out margins. And being that you're coming from a world of pro skiing, does Oakley bring you in-house and train the shit out of you first, just so you know how to run their business?
Not so much in that way. There is a lot of help for sure, but it all evolved. That was also a different time of retail too. So that evolved as we were watching things happen with online sales and different avenues of how retail evolved. So there was certainly some in-house training and getting up to speed with that. And a lot of it just working with other reps and just kind of learning as you go.
What product lines are you hired for at first and how does that evolve over the years?
So Oakley, and I'm still with Oakley, they've been amazing. But yeah, I got that territory and it was all categories and just kind of dove in and learned about the product and went into sales.
Reps in most cases are independent contractors, which means there's like a big startup cost for the reps that I've known. With Oakley, are you required to have a certain vehicle and purchase all the samples and take care of your own health care? And what does it cost to get you up and running as a sales rep?
Wow, that's a good question. I haven't thought about it that way. You are an independent contractor, so you're doing a lot of work on that to run your business like any other business out there. So there's typically some sample stuff. And back then, I think that's kind of the cost of it. But it's not like an all at once chunk to just kind of throttle you into it. They definitely worked with us.
And I'm sure it's one of those deals too, where you're buying the samples and then at the end of every season, you can sell your samples and recoup your money back, I would think.
A little bit of that. Yep, for sure.
And then, like we mentioned in the first podcast, you're never going to suck at anything once you decide that you're passionate about it and you're going to dive headfirst into it. And when you get the job with Oakley, based on what I've learned about you, I'm guessing you went in 150% on it. What does that look like? Is that just like life on the road for that first 2 years, getting to know everyone?
Yeah. I mean, the rep job is a glorified trucker, right? Like you're out on the road at rest stops, cruising the open, especially in Idaho, Montana, when I was out there. I mean, it was just a lot of open road and driving to accounts and doing high fives and saying hello to people and building relationships.
And like a loop for you, say you're going to go on like a 5-day loop. Are you driving for 5 hours a day and visiting 6-7 accounts a day? And that's like a day in the life of a rep?
Yeah, something like that. You know, if you're in a town where it's a little bit more dense, you can spend some time in a town for a couple of days and get a couple more accounts in.
And is it just really like high-fiving shop guys, talking with buyers, and then showing them anything new that you might have? But it's more just FaceTime, and the more they see you, the more they like you. And being that you're a pro athlete, that helps as well?
Well, I don't know if that helped right out of the gate. They probably had some people that were like, who is this guy? But yeah, I mean, you want to build relationships. You want to give product knowledge to the guys and girls that are on the floor selling the product and hyping some people up with some product as well for them to have and test. So a little bit of that, yeah.
You know, in terms of the overall money of being a sales rep, I mean, how long before you're making more than you were as a pro skier? Does that take about 3 months?
I think it took longer than that. And it ebbs and flows, man. It's funny in our world too, like, and I've talked to other people in sales and business and stuff like that. We rely so much on weather. So it's kind of a trip. You know, you could be doing really well and you sell products great and you sell it in, and then you have a bad year with no snow or something like that, and it can hit you. So it depends. But, you know, yeah, it's a good job. It's a great industry of people. I've met some really good friends and some other former athletes that have moved into that. You know, I was just talking to like Mike LaRoche, and he's a killer rep now. And it's fun to like see some of the people like Dave Bluestein and a couple other guys that are in that world.
When you think about pro athletes leaving and coming into the sales rep world, and you think about yourself being a competitive person, there's no more real competitiveness in the pro athlete world because you're not a pro anymore, but you're a pro sales rep. And is there a transition of being competitive in the sales world, of like getting that extra business? Does it get fun and competitive for you in sales?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Like, I definitely think there's some fun competitiveness. There's some salesmanship of, all right, like, let's sell this product. Let's do well. And there is some competitiveness that helps, I think. But you kind of have to like throttle back sometimes too. I mean, you're coming in hot, and trying to be aggressive isn't going to work with all your buyers.
Yeah, you can't come in hot and aggressive all the time, especially in a shit snow year where you know your buyers are really frustrated and they can't sell through anything. And for you, that's also got to be frustrating because you know you're not going to get the orders that you want, that maybe you need to pay your bills. So it's going to be tough on yourself as well. But when you look at it all relationship based, at the end of everything, when they only have this many dollars open to buy and they have to pick between 3 or 4 products, does it come down to relationships? And they're like, I love Josh, I'm going to give him this part of my business?
You know, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, business 101 is what sells. And if it sells, order more of that. And luckily, Oakley is a great brand with great product, and it sells. Now, the relationship part of it is another aspect, because you want to like make sure you're there to help them if there are any issues, like a bad winter or whatever happens in the retail world. So I would say relationships are very, very, very important. And then the sell-through is very important. And it kind of intertwined too, because if you're a good rep, you're giving good product knowledge to the team on the floor, and so they can actually sell your product better too.
A good rep, too, is probably also working with the buyer and managing their order where the buyer might have eyes bigger than what they really need for their store. And you can kind of be like, hey, man, maybe if you cut that order a little bit, I think that'll be better and get reorder business in the future. You can actually look out for the dealer. They probably respect you a lot more when you do that as well.
For sure. I mean, I would say it's usually the opposite of that, where you're like, hey, I think we could do more.
Right.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, I've had both those situations for sure.
And then you think about your competitive world. You won the big contest in Japan, but in the rep world, what awards have you won?
Oh, that's funny. I think I've got the President's Circle Award, and I was nominated for a Rep of the Year. I never won Rep of the Year, I don't think, but been nominated and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of fun. You know, that's a cool part of the biz.
Yeah, for sure. And then with your territory with Oakley, while you start with Idaho, does that thing grow over the years?
Yeah, Idaho, Montana. I had that for about 20 years. And then I recently, 2 years ago, took over the Tahoe, Reno zone. And that has been epic.
So you're in one of the best spots in the entire world for what you like to do. It's probably one of the toughest territories to get, I would think, in the Oakley business.
Yes, definitely for winter snow business. It's a highly sought after territory for a lot of reps and a lot of industries and hard goods and all that kind of stuff.
It's time for my first sponsor break, and I'm going to start things out with outdoor research. I've been using OR products since I moved to Seattle in 2000 because I know they develop and test their products in the brutally wet weather that the Pacific Northwest always delivers. This means that my gear ensures that I'm always warm and dry, and that's the most important thing for me when I'm out there. But wait, there's more. Things have changed a lot since I first started wearing outdoor research gear. While they still use the best materials available, they've hired all new designers to create new fits that will catch your eye. And while OR still makes best-in-class mountaineering gear, it's not your dad's brand anymore. One look through their website and you'll see what I'm talking about. So whether you ski or snowboard, spend your time in the park, the backcountry, or the resort, OR has something for you. And I'm going to make it easier than ever for you to get your hands on some OR gear. When you head on over to outdoorresearch.com, I'm going to get you 25% off of all non-sale items, and you're not going to be able to use this code on OR Pro products as well, and that's more their military stuff, so you don't really need to worry about that. But use the code POWEL25. That's all capitals for the word Powell, no spaces, and then the numbers 25, and you're going to get that discount from OR. My next sponsor is Elan Skis, and I'm in love with both my Ripsticks 106 Black Edition and my Ripsticks 96 Black Edition. They are so fun and lively, all while remaining light and stable. And I'm not the only person who thinks these skis ski better than the competition. Both of these skis were named the editor's pick in Free Skiers magazine test this year. And combined, Elan won over 65 awards in 2022. Great products is why you're seeing more Elan skis on the hill. And making you a better skier is how they've been building a cult following here in the US. But what's really amazing about the brand is that they built a solar power plant on top of their state-of-the-art factory, which means Elan is powered by renewable energy. They've also shortened the supply chain, and now 70% of Elan's materials come from within 250 miles of their factory. And the innovative digital printing technology they're using has already saved 32 tons of volatile waste since 2016. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. My final sponsor is Stanley, another iconic Seattle brand that has been ahead of the curve since 1913. While we all know Stanley for creating that iconic green bottle that kept your grandfather's coffee hot all day long, Stanley still does that, and a lot more these days. And Stanley has always been the right choice when it comes to the planet. Even before we were talking about saving the planet, Stanley was ahead of the game with their reusable water bottle that is still popular today. If you are still using single-use plastics for your beverages, it's time to make a change, and I'm making it easier than ever to save 30% on all products from Stanley. All you need to do is head on over to stanley1913.com, buy some stuff. When you check out, you're going to want to enter the code drinkfast. That's all lowercase, that's all one word, and you're going to save 30% when you put that code in there. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. Oakley has been one of the more innovative brands in snow over the years, and I'm sure with their margins and their price points over the years, dealers love them. Does that change significantly when Oakley starts selling direct to consumer?
I didn't see it change anything significantly at all. I mean, so many of the brands do them, and it's part of retail evolution. And it is something you see out there with just other online stores. So it's just, I think, part of the evolution of retail.
And that's got to be frustrating for a sales rep too, because it not only cuts into the dollars that a dealer would take in, but it cuts into the dollars that you would sell into dealers. So was that frustrating for the reps as well to hear that DTC was happening? It was like, holy shit, now I'm going to have to deal with all these pissed off dealers if they are going to be pissed off, and I'm going to lose money.
It's business, man. It's just that stuff happens. And you have to just take the approach of evolving in business in so many ways. And that's what happens. I can only control what I can control. And how can I help the people that I work with the best and help them get the best in their business? I mean, that's kind of how I would look at it.
Okay. And then how about when Oakley is bought by Luxottica? Does that change anything with the business, or is it still business as usual with no hiccups?
Same things. Like the business evolves. And so many other brands are in the same boat, right? Other brands getting bought up by other companies and all that kind of stuff. So it is part of what happens in the business world right now. We see it with ski resorts and things like that. Luckily, with Oakley, it kept a real core group of the people that started in that category. So it wasn't just like, here we're bought by someone else and here's a whole bunch of other people that you now deal with. It's very similar to how I've seen it in the past. And there's always changes and stuff like that, but that's the way it is these days, man. It's just business is evolving, changing. A lot of big companies buying up smaller ones and putting, more resources can help from that perspective. So it's just the evolution of retail, I think.
With Oakley, based on product alone, you're always number 1 or 2 in your territory. I would think Smith is a major player as well. But Oakley's always going to be up there in the top 2 or 3. That makes things a lot easier for you. You don't have to try to build a brand in a territory because you've got one of these major players that everybody already wants. What made you want to take on a brand like Armada and build that in your territory? Because it was like Armada had launched a couple years before you took them on as a sales rep, and it was like people had heard about them and the product was really hard to get, but there was a really big buzz around them. And then you take them on as a rep and it's like, now it's brand building time. How does that work?
I mean, what a fun brand to build. I was actually the first rep in the Northwest zone. So they had started a year or two before that. I'm not sure they had gone to retail yet. So I took that in the Northwest. So it was even like Washington, Idaho, Montana. It was just rad, dude. It was like the best athletes like Tanner and JF and all these just rad athletes that were associated with it. It was young, it was fresh. They were making product that was really progressive. And it was fun to launch that into the zone.
Was it a no-brainer for those dudes to hire you? Were they like, we know Josh, we've known him forever, he's got his finger on the pulse, and he's been doing this shit for 4 years or so, and we know he can take our product and get it in stores?
I don't know about no-brainer, but yeah, I mean, I'm friends with all those guys, and so we had a lot of connections. And as I was building into the rep world, it seemed to make sense. And I think they did that with a couple other Oakley reps at the time too.
Do they look to you to help build out the whole sales rep program, or are you just another rep with their product line?
Yeah, I was just another rep getting it into the right places. I mean, that was like the early days of their first location in Fremont and getting Armada in there. And then we did like an art gallery, and it was such a new, fresh thing to do at that time. I mean, there was only a couple other brands that I think that were that savvy. K2 would be one of them, but it was really cool.
It's 2006 when you pick them up as a brand. And is it almost like they catch fire right away and you like printing money with Armada?
No, it took some time to get them out there. I mean, just like any cool startup brand like that, they were making changes as they went. I mean, the first year I think was funny. I mean, it was like, where was it being manufactured? It was early on and there was probably some issues with that. But the product, the brand, the idea of it was what you were selling. And then eventually the sales started, you go in and just watch orders from the 1 year double for the next year and the double for the next year. It was starting to blow up and you could tell this thing was getting some fun stoke from everyone.
And then when you think about it, everything is athlete driven at Armada. Marketing is a huge focus. Did Armada have people paying the same attention to detail on the planning, production, and delivery and sell-through as they did on the brand building side? Or were they learning all that shit as they went?
Hans is this amazing man, guy that was running it, and he just was neck deep in it all. And I think he had a real tight eye to make sure everything was going from operations to product to marketing and all that. So it wasn't like bro brand that was just kind of thrown together. I mean, it was legit.
So having him at the top really made everything go?
He was definitely a great leader. I really like discussing business with him, among other things, but he's just a really sharp guy.
Okay. And then when you're a sales rep with Armada and you're using the product and you've been an athlete with a lot of the athletes who started the brand, do you have any impact on the product being a rep? Or is it like you can give them feedback, but the brand's really going to do whatever it wants?
Both those brands, yes. Oakley and Armada, for sure. In fact, one of the fun stories, and I brought his name up a couple times in the first part, was Dave Steiner moved from athlete into a position at Oakley for R&D. And so his whole job there for a while was basically cruising. We gave him a hard time because it was like the raddest job. But his whole job was to cruise around with pro athletes and test product. And so he would be cruising all over the world testing product for Oakley. So that was rad. And as a rep, we would get our heads up, hey, what do you think of this product? Can you test this? How do you think this product will sell in this category? All that kind of stuff. So we got a little bit of that. And Armada was that even more at that time because they were making skis. Like Tanner's first ski was really progressive, and no other companies were doing things like that. And Armada would do it. I remember a brand that I worked with back in the day, and I would be like, hey, I want this in the ski and this and that. And they'd be like, sure. But instead of wood, we're going to do foam. And instead of this, we're going to do that. And I was like, well, that's not the ski we want. So that's kind of the inner side of the industry there. But lucky for me is both those brands, Oakley and Armada, are neck deep in R&D and doing what the athletes want.
And then I guess one thing that people really don't think about the sales rep's life is that when you are showing your lines off to people and not at a trade show or anything, when you're going door to door, it's like you have to show up in your big truck. You have to bring in 50 pairs of skis. You have to bring in every sunglass and every item of clothing that you have. Is it pretty much like a manual labor job where you have to talk about all the things you're moving and then put it back in the truck and then go do it again?
Sure. I mean, demos for sure, right? You set up and tent and product and all that kind of stuff. So there's some heavy lifting for sure.
Does it get to be just full on Groundhog Day? Do you ever get sick of sitting in a parking lot and putting out skis or doing whatever you're doing?
It's a job, man. I mean, there's good days and tough days and all that stuff. But from my perspective, and I remember saying this at one point, I'm so hyped. I get to work in the industry that I got to be a part of early on and sell brands that I am fired up on. So yeah, are there tough times? Sure. But when you sit back and say, hey, look, this is pretty rad.
There are tough times in every job, and you can do everything right in your job. But if things on the back end aren't done right, dealers are going to end up pissed off at you and you're going to hear about it. I'm sure you've had a dealer who has a $50,000 order that they expect to deliver in late July that shows up in October and they're fucking losing their mind on you. How do you deal with that?
No, we don't make any mistakes, man.
Well, the mistakes, they might not even be your mistakes. They're usually going to be on the manufacturer side, but you just have to take them and be like, oh no, I got word that it's not coming. But they look at it as it's your problem, I would think.
Yeah, but I mean, dude, this whole thing in the last couple of years has just changed the game. And people with the shipping supply stuff, it's crazy. I mean, you never know when you're going to get product and when product can't ship. I mean, that whole bike world got bonkers for a while because people couldn't get it. So it's kind of changed the game a little bit where buyers, sure, they used to be really frustrated with certain things, but now it's kind of everyone's duded it down a little bit and they're like, all right, man, well, if we can get it, we'll try to sell it. And that's just kind of the name of the game.
Yeah. Well, what about the shitty times when they get it, they try to sell it and they might sell it, but then they don't pay their bill? And I'm sure that's a shitty thing for you to deal with and they have to go through credit with the brand. But does it ever get to the point where they're like, hey, Josh, you got to go to the store and get our product back?
No, I don't do that stuff, man. I'm not in that world.
Okay. But I mean, it does happen though, where dealers just can't pay their bills and their friends. What happens in those situations?
There's things that happen like that, I guess. But from a rep standpoint, we just try to keep ourselves out of that.
All right. eventually when you pick up a ski line and you've got things going amazing with Oakley, that means that you're probably going to have so much work that you're going to need to bring in a sub rep. Do you have people that work with you in your rep group?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, it kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, early on, I had an incredible sales associate. Eric Schnibbe is unbelievable. And he was young and hungry out of college in Spokane. And he was like, hey, can I help? And I had a pretty big territory. So I was like, let's go for it. And he's unbelievable. He's one of the best humans I know. And he came in and worked with Oakley under me, and then also took on Armada, and eventually took Armada out of my rep field. And he took that and ran with it and did a great job.
Nice. So that means that your business is very healthy if you're able to hire somebody else, and you say it ebbs and flows, and that's like that with everybody's business. But that's enough talking about the rep job. I could talk about money, but I think everybody should know that sales reps, as long as you have good lines, you can make some really good money if you're willing to put in the work. If you have shitty lines, you need to have a lot more lines, and it's still rolling the dice, you don't know. But you have something else in your life other than just selling products. You have the part of skiing that you really love, the contest aspect of it. But eventually in your career, when you retire from pro skiing, you become a judge. And that kind of happens almost immediately after you retire from professional skiing. How do you get into judging, and what's the first judging gig?
It was, again, one of those things where it was like the timing was right. And I think my first judging gig was the Johnny Mosley Invitational in Steamboat. He had all the A-teamers, the real big names. And I was so fired up to judge that. Plake was like head judge. But we were looking at my heroes like Jim Moran and Kent Kreitler and McConkey, and all that crew was in this event. And it was so cool. But it was early on in judging, and Plake did a great job of kind of putting us in the panel, and he just kind of made it simple. And I used his theme ever since then, but he was always like, hey, make sure the person that everyone loved and was the hottest run of the day wins. That's the big thing. Don't make it so complicated that people don't really know who won. That was kind of where it started. And then after that, we went into the X Games the next year, where I was done. A handful of other athletes were like done. And the idea was, hey, let's make sure we have the best athletes there in the panel to judge the best athletes like the X Games. And so I had guys like Shane Zox and Shane Anderson and Shanna Shad. And, that was the early one. Later on, I had incredible athletes, just stars like Evan Ratz, Cousin, Bellinger.
All the legends of the sport became judges.
All the legends. I mean, Mike LaRoche was awesome. All these guys took it really seriously, and I loved that. And I randomly started trying to organize it all and help with getting the right people. And then here's the biggest one. Two guys that were instrumental to this, Steele Spence and Mike Atkinson. Together, those guys, we kind of all created basically a judging philosophy or a format that worked. And excuse me if I keep going forward with this stuff, but it just was like, then all these events started happening around the world. And then they would say, hey, we'll call Josh and Mike and Steele and those guys. And eventually we would just kind of go to these other events and teach our format and judge the event.
I mean, I would think in the beginning, before you guys had a format that you were teaching, that every event that you got to that hired you as a judge, they either had judging criteria set by themselves and they wanted you to judge it that way, or people were making it up on the spot. So it was kind of like you guys came in and set a standard, not officially, but set the way that things should be judged unofficially in the beginning.
Yes, that's exactly it. And there was other things, Mike. It was like going up and making sure that the judges could see all the jumps on a slope style, or there was heat in the judging booth, or yeah, this is how we do it. We don't judge hit for hit. We judge an overall impression. The hardest thing about it was combining some type of format, but letting it be progressive friendly and letting the athletes dictate the progression of it instead of laying down like some gnarly judging format that would dictate how athletes roll.
You know, on a side note of that, the whole time that you're a judge, you also represent brands as a salesman. Did anybody ever have an issue with you repping Oakley and Armada and then judging Oakley and Armada athletes who are winning X Games gold? Was there any issues with that ever?
Yeah, I mean, it came up a couple times that people would say that, but the quick argument is that everyone in that judging booth had an affiliation with a brand. they were all pro athletes. So it was really like, hey, if we had a judge in here that didn't have an affiliation with the brand, then he probably is not qualified to be, a judge right now. And also too, my position evolved into a position where I wasn't actually putting scores in. I was really just like setting up the booth for judges to kind of create the format so that they would put the scores in.
Yeah, it's like you took a leadership position and eventually became the head judge for the X Games. And was it something where you just started organizing things and everybody eventually just started looking to you as the guy that was making things happen, and the title of head judge was kind of thrust upon you because you were organizing?
I mean, kind of. The first one, they said, hey, who's the head judge? And Zox and those guys just kind of pointed the finger at me to say, hey, let Josh do it. And I was like, okay, cool. And then from there, it rolled out. And then, there was just so many different events going on. It was X Games, it was the WSI, and then there was stuff in Japan and LOX. And this is all before the FIS comes in, which is a whole nother story. But yeah, early on, we're just kind of going all over the place. Someone would call me. If I couldn't make it, I'd be like Mike Atkinson or Steele Spence or Evan Rapps and, try to just send the best people we had to go do it.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and I'm going to start things off with Best Day Brewing. I just received a case of the newest Best Day flavor, the Hazy IPA, and in about a sip, it became my new favorite beer from Best Day. The Kolsch is now a close number 2. And for those of you that don't know what Best Day is, think a NA beer that tastes even better than an alcoholic version. And the best part is, it won't slow you down. Now, I still drink alcoholic beer, but these days, between picking up my kid, running errands, and just living life, it's nice to have a non-alcoholic choice. To drink a beer that won't get me in trouble. That's what Best Day is for me. It's the smart choice that's full of flavor, and at under 60 calories, I know I'm not going to pack on the weight like I did with alcoholic brews, and without the alcohol, I'm not going to feel like crap the morning after. So next time you're at the store, support the show by grabbing a 6-pack of Best Day. And if you can't find it at your local grocer, head on over to bestday.com. Orders of over $50 get free shipping. My next sponsor is Puffin Drinkware. And if you don't know Puffin, well, you're missing out, because a drink without a puffin just isn't the same. So now you're probably asking yourself, what's a puffin? And I'm going to tell you. It's personality-infused beverage apparel. Think stylish clothing for your drink that uses insulation technology with a thermal liner for colder sips to the very last drop. You're going to be the hit of any party or gathering with a puffin, and with silhouettes ranging from hoodies to spacesuits to ski patroller outfits to life jackets, your drink will never look cooler or cuter. Everyone needs at least one puffin, because they will put a smile on your face every time you look down at your drink. And Puffin is going to make that easier than ever for you to do. They're going to save you 20% off all Puffin orders, and all you need to do is go shopping at puffindrinkware.com, and when you head to checkout, enter the code POWELMOVEMENT, that's all lowercase, all one word, no spaces, and you will save 20% off your Puffin drinkware, and you will have the cutest drinkware in the entire planet. My final sponsor is Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Peter Glenn has been the best-in-class one-stop shop for all your ski needs since 1958, and your snowboard needs since the sport started. The reason why is because in-store, Peter Glenn has a knowledgeable staff to help you get the perfect setup at one of their many locations. But I get it. You may not be able to make it to a Peter Glenn store, and that's okay. Peter Glenn has a best-in-class online shopping experience over at peterglenn.com. The site has all the brands, all the products, and they offer free shipping on orders of $49 or more, a no-hassle return policy, and they price match any reputable shop on the web. So if you find a product for cheaper at a reputable Peter Glenn competitor, Peter Glenn will match that price. Please do that every time you shop, because when you do, it gives Peter Glenn more of a reason to continue to support some cool things in snow, like this podcast, Johnny Mosley, and a lot more. So please support the brand that supports me, and check out Peter Glenn before you buy something anywhere else. Those are my sponsors. Now it's time to jump back into the podcast. When I listen to commentators talk about contests, you hear them talk about the judging, and we always hear the words range, and the commentators talk about how judges can't score something too high too early, or it can ruin that whole range and scoring breakdown. Can you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, our format early on was basically a scoring version of ranking. So it was out of 0 to 100, and the 5 judges would put their scores in and get an average. Sometimes they dropped high and low depending on what event we were doing. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the hard thing is it's like a ranking system. So first run of the day, you don't want to throw in a high 90s because you're like, man, there could be 10 other runs that beat this. So range was a big important part of that.
But what if that first run of the day was the best run of the day? What if someone's first run was like a perfect score, but you as the head judge, do you have to coach those judges into scoring it lower so there is room for something to score higher?
There were plenty of runs that would do that, but that meant the winning run might be a 90 that day. You had to just rank appropriate to it. So one of the interesting things about judging too was just how much we would see, because things early on were progressing so fast. It was like, oh my gosh, we heard that this so-and-so is doing these tricks and what's going on here and there. And so we had to prepare ourselves, and a lot of it in practice was important. So we would watch a practice and start putting together like, okay, so-and-so is doing this and that, and kind of prepare ourselves as much as we could.
And I always thought, especially in the early days, that it just wasn't fair to the judges or the athletes that you're going to put 30 grand on a contest where a judge doesn't have that video review of every hit again, like they would in any other big sport. So you can't really say, oh, I can't tell if he tickled the grab or he held it all the way through and there's no way for me to see it again. So I just have to judge it on memory. And it kind of seemed a little bit unfair in the beginning. Were you guys frustrated in the judges booth?
Well, there was so many different things. I mean, one, there was a time restraint. So I remember the X Games and ESPN saying, hey, you got 30 seconds to get a score in, at times. So we had to work within those guidelines. It was extraordinarily stressful. I remember a lot of judges, where we would be arguing with who we think is best, and we had ways to work through that. I remember some that I felt like we should give a tie. I mean, it was a judge sport. It's part of the fun of people arguing with officials at the NFL and things like that. You can argue about the judging. I get it. We always had one person that liked us afterwards, and it was the winner. Everyone else, didn't. I would say some events that stand out that I just thought were incredibly challenging to score were the battles between Simon and Tanner in the half pipe. They were unbelievably awesome, both of them. I remember those like yesterday. It was incredible. I also remember a CR and Candide half pipe event that was unreal. And they just put on the show, and it was really about the athletes. And we're just like trying our best to pick a winner. And the harder things were like picking between 12th and 13th. Oftentimes that's the cutoff to get into the finals.
Yep.
Those are the hardest because those can oftentimes deal with maybe a fall or a touchdown or a missed grab. Those ones were the really difficult ones, I felt like.
And with every contest, judging is one of those things that comes with a ton of criticism, especially online. And you personally got destroyed a bunch online. Do you ever look at those forums, or is it better just for you to ignore that stuff?
No. I mean, early on, it was like the early days of those forums even happening. So luckily, the first couple, we didn't have them. And then later on, I think it was like new schoolers and stuff like that. They would start just hammering on the judges. And, my panel was badass, dude. Like, I remember someone coming and arguing about an event one time. And I was like, I've got JF Kusan and Evan Raps on this panel.
Yeah.
Are you going to really try to argue with those guys? And that was kind of my approach to it. It was like, who better than these guys?
What athlete lost their mind the most on you guys at the judges' booth at an event?
I don't remember athletes so much. I remember some like team managers and some people really getting fiery on stuff like that. But they didn't really come at me. The funniest thing is them throwing snowballs at us in the X Games. That was awesome. And I remember too, like Uncle E, who is the best. I love that guy. And Mike Douglas were in the booth next to us. And we could kind of hear him every once in a while. We're in our booth judging, and then they go out. And then if they didn't like what we did, they would be saying it. And then I'm like side-eyeing them going like, guys, stop that. We're going to get snowballed. And the snowballs would come flying at us and stuff like that. But it was fun to think back. It was really stressful. And guys like Steele Spence and Mike Atkinson were just incredibly helpful, and we had a good team.
All right. And before I talk about the creation of the Association of Free Skiing Professionals, which you helped found, you were around when the IFSA was created. And a big part of the reason that Shane McConkey started the IFSA was that there was no judging standards anywhere, there was no rankings, and he didn't want the FIS taking over. You were a part of that as a jib consultant. What did that entail?
I think it was just kind of the early days of this, like trying to talk about how we're judging slopestyle events and half pipe events and going through that same thing. I mean, I think that's kind of part of how the AFP started off of his philosophy with what he was doing and athlete driven.
Yeah, because by the mid to late 2000s, there was a need for an association representing the competitive skiers just for structure and communication, rankings, and judging. I mean, at that point, it was the Wild West. And I remember, like, for the X Games, if an athlete was a shoe-in, they'd get in. But if not, I'd have to email Chris Schuster and almost beg him, be like, hey, man, I'd really like to get this guy in. And you might not know him. He lives in Norway, but he's got this trick, this trick, this trick. And he's definitely a threat for the podium. And it was me like lobbying for people. And I'm sure every team manager was doing that, which isn't really the fair way to get into a contest. Do you remember what the selection process was before the formation of the AFP?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit like what you said. There were a handful of events that maybe, qualified people, but it was like a wild, wild west. You get in there. Who's marketing people to get in there? I mean, that's one of the primary reasons that Schuster needed a ranking system so that he can say, hey, let's tie in all the events that are high level events around the world so that we have a ranking system and we can start really just going down the list of top athletes to get them into the X Games. And then, yeah, we can move into the AFP if you want there.
Yeah, I mean, there was that part, the ranking system, and Gerard was also a part of it. You were a part of it. I'm missing one person. Who am I missing?
Mike Spencer.
There we go, Michael Spencer, who's another badass in representing all the athletes. He's been on my podcast as well. And so you four are like the key guys that are doing it, and you're the part that's going to be the head of all judging. What do you do with the judging for AFP?
Same kind of stuff that I was doing was just kind of trying to create certified judges. So all the athletes that we'd have would kind of like say, hey, this is kind of the judges that are approved by AFP. They know the format that we use and how do we do that. Steele Spence did a great job of putting together like a judging book of like how we judge and then making sure that the events would do that and use our judging format, even so much so of like, hey, this is what we do. We do best 2 out of 3 or best 1 out of 2 runs. And then we go into the final, we cut to 12, we best 1 out of 2 so that there was some kind of organization.
Is the goal kind of like, hey, we have a vision that we know that these sports are going to be in the Olympics at one point, and we want to have our judging dialed ahead of time so that when the FIS does package this thing up and try to get it ready for the Olympics, that we're there to be the judging group that the FIS is going to look to?
Kind of. I guess it worked out that way, but there was a little bit of like a battle against them. We were like, oh, they're going to try to take our events and how are they going to do it? And we'd hear things like they're going to use mogul or aerial judges to do these events, or they're going to use snowboard judges for these events and things like that. So we were kind of battling 2 different angles to just try to make sure we had our stuff tightened up, where it was like, hey, we have a format, we have qualified judges. These guys are all former athletes. This is how it should be done. And I can tell you about the next phase is when we went to the FIS in Zurich and had a meeting with them about it.
Yeah, and what happens at that meeting? Describe what you've laid on the table and how it pans out.
Well, we went out there. It was like Spencer, Schuster, and I. We go out to the FIS, has a big meeting. They've got the sport going into the Olympics that we've heard. So we fly out to Zurich and we sit in with these meetings. And it was very cool, like in the sense of we were working together. As much as they have a bad rap and there's some tough things that they do, but there was a loss of some really good people in there that were trying to make it right. So we sit in there, but I was really protective, I guess. And so I remember sitting in a meeting with all the FIS guys, and it's like, everyone's got their hands crossed. And I'm like, hey, guys, it's cool that you got this sport in the Olympics, but I'm guessing you don't know how to judge it. Right. And they kind of like shake their head like maybe, and I just said, why don't you let us do it? We're doing this with the X Games. We're doing this with all these big events around the world. Why don't you let us do it? And it was kind of the weirdest thing because I don't think this is normal for them, but they basically were like, all right. And then I was like, oh shit, what have I got myself into? And then again, like Mike, Steele, and I just start going around the world and start sanctioning more judges and doing our format and clinics. And then, going that route and kind of starting to work with the FIS and USSA and all the regional ones to do Grand Prix and qualifiers and World Cups.
What's crazy is you're talking about stuff that just sounds like hours and hours of work, but you're also a sales rep with 2 brands that you're representing. So how do you have all the time to do all this stuff with the AFP and do your job?
Well, I mean, it was over a long period of time. So this didn't happen in just a year or two. I mean, it happened in over 14 years probably. I definitely I remember weekends where it was like, hey, I'm going to jet to Europe for an event and fly back. So there was some crazy stuff like that. But, it was also exciting. And when something's exciting and you have passion for it, you can find the time.
Yep. And, looking back to 2000, you had said, and I'll quote, "We don't want to have a bunch of 50-year-old judges sitting there telling us what we did good, what we did wrong, or what we did right. The crowd doesn't want to see that either." Almost 25 years later, would your 25-year-old self be proud of where judging in the sport is right now?
Well, yeah. I mean, I definitely would say from where I ended off, which is I was done at the Sochi Olympics, I felt like we did a good job. I felt like we let the athletes dictate the sport. That was the biggest, most important thing. There was a lot of pressure to make more formulated rules about judging. And our approach was to try to keep it open and progressive friendly. So I was pleased with it. It was funny because I think I was, 40 or something. And I started saying like, dude, I'm the old guy. I got to get the hell out of here. And so I kind of made it that far and moved on.
That's got to be the highlight, I would think, of your judging career, or one of the highlights of your judging career. What made Sochi so special for you?
Well, a lot of hard work and the great athletes that were a part of it. And the event spoke for itself, right? Like I remember after slopestyle getting an email from NBC saying, we need to know everything about this event. The ratings are huge. And I'm like, I know, right? Like it's badass sport. So I think that's for me is like letting the athletes be the show. Judging just kind of quietly sat in the back and did the best we could. But Mike, it was so stressful, dude. Like getting up to that, I had one of the judges puke before the morning of our first event because he was so stressed. And it was tense. We were in Russia dealing with a judging event. And I felt like we had an amazing crew to go through that. And I always remember the last event of it all and just kind of looking around at the crowd. And I knew that was the end of my career in that as I was walking away. And I was pretty fired up, man. A lot of people put a lot of work into that to get it there. And it was pretty special. But Russia was also crazy. I mean, it was like Olympics, like the X Games, our biggest concern was getting into the target house for a party.
Right.
And the Olympics was like, there's going to be warships in the Black Sea to get you out of there if you need to. And we're like, what in the world? So it was a different level.
Yeah, that is insane. You never really think about needing to be evacuated by warships from a ski event, but you had that in your career. So one thing I like to talk about, which you probably know, is I like to talk about money a little bit. And when I think about judging, is everything paid for, like all travel, all hotel, and then you get a per diem?
Yep. And we tried to set rates with AFP so that we would get paid, not huge, but like worthwhile of all the work. I mean, these were all day events going through so many different athletes. It was very hard and stressful. So yes, we would get travel paid for and, good little kick at the end of the weekend.
I mean, when you go to the Olympics and you spend 10 days in Russia judging all these events, do you come home with like a $10,000 check?
Well, the Olympics was a little bit different. I mean, that was a little bit funky because they didn't pay us as much as we thought. That was a little dicey early on. I remember one of the judges was like, I'm out of here. And I was like, no, man, hang in there. Let's get through that. But everything else leading up to that, yes, it was good money for sure.
So it's like pretty much an all-inclusive vacation, and then you have to judge for a few hours every event?
I wouldn't say vacation, man. The days that we were working were long days and stressful. Yes, was it fun to travel to Norway and to all these different places around the world, and you get your ski days in the day before or the day after? Yes. And that was really the fun part of it. It was special, man.
Well, it's amazing that you're able to have the ski career, but then do it again for another 14 years on the judges aspect of it all. But life isn't all rainbows and everything when you're a sales rep. I mean, you spent the better part of 14 years driving around the country, showing off product, and I'm sure partying every single night because that's what people want from you. But eventually that lifestyle gets old. And I think like 6 years ago, you've changed paths and quit drinking. Tell me about the new healthier path of Josh Loubek and how you started Niima vitamins and quit drinking.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks. I think that's important to bring up because we live, a really wild life in the ski industry, and adrenaline and addiction issues kind of like go hand in hand. And I was in a place that I felt I was unhealthy. I was down. It was kind of after judging, and I was a little bit lost. I was going through some tough stuff in life, divorce, all that. And I decided to quit drinking, and I went straight edge, and it was hard. And it was something that I've had some really good talks with some of, the people from this world of athletes and some friends and stuff like that I've created some really amazing connections with. But yeah, man, I quit drinking and I love it. I didn't want to be the over emotional drunk divorce guy, and I went another route. And in that same breath, in that same time, things kind of just continued to get better, even though it was really hard. But yeah, going to your second point, Niima was something that I'm a part of. It's radically simple wellness. And I was getting into supplements as I got healthier, but I was just kind of self-prescribing and picking out like random vitamins and stuff like that. And I'd heard that like, hey, unless you have an impeccable diet, you probably need some vitamins and minerals. So I was all over the place and nothing was really speaking to me. The supplements were either very like workout gym guy or hippie woo woo. So the idea was to come up with a supplement that had a little bit of everything, but in one pill. And it's really simple, but it's also marketed towards and performed for people like skiers and snowboarders and skateboarders and creators to assist in things like all day energy and clarity and focus and some muscle recovery and things like that. So that's kind of how Niima was born, apart with a couple other people, one of them being a former pro snowboarder, Kelly Williams. He's awesome and a great branding guy and a doctor and all that kind of stuff. So Niima is a passion project of mine right now that I'm super, super fired up about.
Is it doing well?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those startup things where we're just getting the word out. We're getting it to the right people. We put it in a couple cool shops, snowboard shops and ski shops, and people are stoked on it. What I like is that some of the top athletes that we have on it are asking for it more and more, where they're like, man, I really love that stuff. They feel like it's helping them with clarity and recovery and endurance and things like that. It's a great mix of vitamins, in one pill, daily vitamin.
Well, I swear by it and I take it every day, and I thank you for continuing to send it to me. But now we've been going for a long time and we can't go any longer. It is time for us to get into inappropriate questions. And this time I'm going to head up to Whistler because I was able to get one of your old roommates, a dude who's a staple in that Whistler crew, Glenn Mittendorfer, to ask the questions. And I believe Glenn talked to Zox and the whole crew came up with some good ones. But before we get into Glenn's questions, I have one inappropriate question for you. I'm not going to tell you who this one came from, but my inappropriate question for you is, tell us the wearing sweatpants to the strip club story.
Oh my God, I don't even know what you're talking about. No comment.
All right. Well, that is great. We will go with your first inappropriate question from Mittendorfer right now. I am going to cue those up because my question did not go over as planned. And here comes question number one from Glenn.
Number one would be, I'd love to hear the incident of a toothbrush with Shane Zox in Aspen. And I'd love to hear some details.
All right, there was a chuckle on your end. I think you know what he's talking about.
I do, man. It was before I got married. I'm since divorced, but they did a little prank on me for a bachelor party, and we were in Aspen, and they took my toothbrush and took photos with my toothbrush all over the place in the X Games, including, I think, in an inappropriate body part from Shane Zox. So that was a little gross.
Oh, man, that is disgusting. That's terrible, but funny, I guess, when you saw the pictures, or at least really funny for everybody else. Let's jump into question number two.
Question number two is, I'd also love to hear the story about a certain hairdresser and her laundry.
I don't remember that. I'm glad I don't drink anymore and I don't have to like think about all those like crazy days back in the day.
All right, so you don't remember that one, which is fine. Hopefully you're going to remember his final inappropriate question, and I'm going to cue it up right now.
When you and I were living together, I'd love to hear about the incident of you falling naked out of the loft.
That one was just silly. I mean, it's the same thing. We were wild and crazy, but I do remember being in a loft that I roomed with Glenn, and I was, getting out of the loft to go to the bathroom or something like that. I leaned back, broke the railing, fell down completely like 10 feet onto the ground. And it was ridiculous. I mean, just classic times. Again, I'm so thankful that I am straight edge. I don't drink, none of that stuff. But that was the good old days.
All right. So that was an appropriate question, and that's the podcast. And man, you've lived life on your own terms. It's like you were kind of a jock for a period in your life, although you skateboarded as well. But you crushed team sports. And then when you're done with that, you were kind of like, fuck it, I'm going to be a competitive skier. And then you made that happen. And then instead of dragging out a dying career, you went right into a dream rep job that keeps you in the industry and making more money than you had ever before made. Then on top of that, you get to judge. So you still get to go on the pro trips without any expectations. So it's a dream of a life that only happens when you have the work ethic, the talent, and the personality of a Josh Loubek. So I thank you for sharing your story and your time with me.
Thanks, brother. I really appreciate this, Mike. I think it's a fun story to tell. I think you do a really good job, and you're well organized and good research.
So that was part 2 with Josh Loubek, and talk about a dude with a vision for the future. Most pros ride out their career, milk it for a few years. But not Josh. He was one of the few from his era that didn't skip a beat, and not only landed an incredible job in the industry, but he was able to stay just as close to the sport as he was before with his judging. And like he alluded to when he was 20, he was out of the sport before he became an old and out-of-touch judge. So it's pretty cool that Josh was able to stay true to his word. That's the podcast. At this point, it's time for the review of the week, and it's a 5-star review. This review comes from H2O Kiter, and here is the review. Mike does an excellent job making the interviews unique and interesting, as the athletes on the media tour tend to play the same set list on every podcast, not here on the Powell Movement. Well, that is short and sweet, and I appreciate that you realize that I try to differentiate every person in my podcast. While everyone does have their origin story, and it can be cookie cutter, I definitely tell that story, but then I like to dive into the nooks and crannies and pull out information that makes each of these athletes and behind-the-scenes players interesting, because everybody does have a truly unique and different story. It's my job to pull it out and make it interesting for you, and I'm glad that you realize that. Since I read the review on my podcast, I want you to email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com with your mailing address. I have a few limited edition items, and I'm going to send you one of them. So when I get that address, I will ship you something out. Anybody else who wants to get a limited edition Powell Movement item, all you need to do is review me on iTunes, or review me on Spotify, or post something on social media and tag me. If I read it on the show, email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com, and you will get a limited edition item too. I thank you so much for doing it. I believe it also helps in the algorithm and helps this show grow, so thank you for that as well. I thank everyone for listening. And finally, I want everyone to support my amazing sponsors, because without them, we would have no podcast. They are Puffin Drinkware, Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Best Day Brewing, and Stanley. Have a great week, everyone.